You're listening to the Not Just Numbers podcast, a conversation with mathematicians on their work and their lives to get to know them and discuss common biases and misconceptions. Hi everybody and welcome to the 7th episode of It's Not Just Number. Today we are going again with something slightly out of the ordinary. We have invited two professors from different departments, from the Department of Computer Science and the one from Artificial Intelligence, to discuss their research, which to me at least sound extremely mathematical, even though they are not in a math department. And so this is also the beginning of a sub-series of our podcast where we explore a bit mathematics outside mathematics departments. And let me not wait further here and let me introduce our guests. So sitting next to me, there is Professor Davide Grossi from the Artificial Intelligence Department.
Hi, everyone.
And on my right, there is Professor Jorge Perez from the Computer Science Department.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
And of course, in front of me, there is Anna.
Good morning.
Davide, can you tell us a bit who you are and what you do? Trying to explain it as I am 5.
Sure. So, thanks for having me this morning. So I work at the Department of AI. I'm a professor in collective decision-making and computation. So what I'm interested in my research, but also in a lot of my teaching, it's collective decision-making problems. So anything that has to do with taking good decisions in groups, be that groups of humans. So how can you devise procedures that allows humans to take good decisions together, or even groups of computational agents, so artificial intelligences. How can they find a way to cooperate together, to work together? So those are what I refer to as collective decision-making problems. That's what drives a lot of my interests.
Fascinating.
In what circumstances, in what real-life circumstances would this be used? Do you have an example of this?
Yes, well, for I think basically the whole of our society is about procedures to take decisions together. So that's also what interests me, beyond the concrete research problems, but also more perhaps philosophically, is like, how can we find good ways of cooperating, making sure we create a society that we're happy about. And of course, the typical example in human society is definitely in society like in the Netherlands or in Europe. You can think of democratic processes. So how can you design democratic procedures that are fair, representative, that give legitimacy to the decisions that are taken. So this is, of course, an area of research that was born, say, in political philosophy, but then economists also took a lot of interest in that in the last century, and maybe in the last 20 years or so, but maybe even further than that, there's been increasing interest in this type of processes, also from a computing point of view. And so within the AI community, there's a healthy sub-community working on these processes. So you ask for an example, you can think of what is often referred to as democratic innovation. So if you want to bring citizens closer to decision-making, maybe in their city, for instance, you can ask them, the city could say, hey, here I have a pot of money. How would you like to use it? Rather than taking the decision centrally, you ask the question to your citizens. Now the question is, first of all, how do you put this question to your citizens? What kind of information you ask them? And how do you process that information? So those are essentially algorithmic problems. And you can look at that algorithmically.
So it's certainly also a tool for decentralizing this decision-making. That's very useful. It sounds useful.
Yeah, well, I believe it's useful.
Yes.
Yes, so definitely. So you can think, of course, when we think of democracy, democracy has an element of decentralization, right? You want to bring decision-making power back to, people or citizens, that are, whoever is concerned with the decision, that whoever has a stake in the decision you need to take. Yeah, how do you realize that decentralization? Of course, has a philosophical side, like what is fair, what is good, but it has also an algorithmic side, how you make sure that those principles are realized in the process.
Thank you. Sounds very interesting. How about you, Jorge?
Well, my name is Jorge Perez, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Computer Science here in Groningen. I am the leader of the Fundamental Computing Group, and we are interested in how the foundations of computing actually enable progress in software development. So, in my particular research field, I am essentially intrigued by the idea of software errors. So, why software makes things that we are not expecting, or why sometimes something that is working correctly stops working. And this is a very common situation for many people. So actually my research it's born out of my curiosity or my intriguedness about software errors. And more in particular, I focus on programs or in systems that actually are concurrently interacting. So you can imagine, for instance, when you go to a shop and then you want to pay with your PIN, right? So you as a person, you're interacting only with the PIN machine, but this is a very complex system in which you can imagine a distributed setting behind the payment infrastructure, a distributed setting that informs the shop that you have already paid. And many things can go wrong. And actually, it's sort of a wonder that many of these systems work correctly. And even it's more of a wonder when you consider that there are many typical methods for constructing software that essentially are not that rigorous. So there is this very interesting dichotomy between how our society is built around computers and software, and how we are not there yet in terms of having a systematic and rigorous way of constructing programs. So for many people, things work great, and they only realize that there is something that could go wrong when things go wrong, right? Like last summer when there was this huge outtake of reservation systems in the airports, right? So this was a silly mistake, a really small thing in the update of a system that has this completely planetary effect on how things did not work. And in those situations that people say, wait, probably we should rethink how we are constructing software, or actually, let me think, how is that actually we construct software? And the answer is that, well, essentially, in most situations, people run lots of tests to their programs, crossing fingers that the edge cases that lead to errors never appear in practice. So what we do in our research is to say, okay, well, let's try to take a mathematical approach to software construction, in which we look carefully at how programs are constructed, also how programs are analyzed, and how we can actually enforce some correctness guarantees on programs before these programs go out to be released to the public or to customers or to citizens.
And so you're very interested in those edge cases, if they can occur, of course.
Precisely, because mathematics can tell you with an absolute guarantee those edges cannot occur, right? And that's where I believe the whole story of my research connects with the podcast, because ultimately it's about mathematical tools helping us, theoretical computer scientists, to see, okay, this is going to work in practice under these assumptions, or I can prove a theorem about correctness under these assumptions. And whether these assumptions are practically relevant, well, this is an interesting discussion. That is also part of what we do. It's a bit separate in the sense that, of course, there's a gap or a step between like the theory that we develop and the practice of software, but it's at the end some mathematical assumptions.
Would you then say that you're very detail-oriented in the research, or look at the system overall? How do you work on this?
That's an interesting question, because as a computer scientist, my answer will be, we computer scientists are interested in abstraction, right? So we have a complex world, and then we will try to find the right abstractions to describe it, right? And details, of course, they are very important when you are doing, for instance, the mathematical developments related to some theory, which is already an abstraction of the complex world. But yes, so details are important. The level of rigor is important. But as a computer science, let's say, from the computer science perspective, you have to take into account abstractions. You're building abstractions for programmers to write programs, and you're building abstractions that match the intentions of some designers, of engineers somewhere. So details, it's an interesting question.
To a certain point would then be the the answer, I guess.
Yes, so it's a bit relative in a way, yes.
I see. So getting back to getting to know you, actually, because that's what we aim to do in the first half of the episode. Why do you do it? Why do you find it interesting what you're doing in your research?
Well, I find it interesting because it's a source of very complicated problems that start from very simple observations in many cases. You see, so these days I'm particularly interested in something that is called deadlocks. And you can think of a deadlock as when you are, for instance, in an intersection in your bike, and there are no traffic lights, and then you try to coordinate just by having eye contact with somebody else. Okay, should I go first? Should you move on? And so on. And this is incredibly common in software components, because complex systems are built of many different kinds of components, written in many different kinds of programming languages, and they get stuck. And deadlocks refer to the situation in which software gets stuck because one system, for instance, is awaiting a message from some other component, and that message never arrives. And from the perspective of the other component, they have the exact same similar situation. So the idea of deadlocks, it's quite simple, right? I can explain deadlocks to my daughter when we're riding a bike, right? But they're incredibly difficult to exclude from programs. Because you have to look in this kind of circular analysis, like I'm looking at the perspective of my component from the perspective of other components and vice versa. So you have this kind of a non-local analysis of programs, right? So it's not sufficient just to look at or to analyze and to properly build a single component. You need to think about how the other components will interact at some point. And as programmers find it incredibly difficult because they don't have the whole situation of all single components when they look at the screen at their code. So this makes things incredibly difficult. And yet, if I go to my whiteboard, I can give you a very simple example in one line of what a deadlock is. Mm-hmm. So there is this kind of a very interesting irony between things that are very easy to explain but are incredibly difficult to exclude in real life, like deadlocks.
Did it also form the original reason for why you were in this field of research?
No, not really. So I got into this field of research because when I was doing my bachelor I'm an engineer. So I did my bachelor in engineering in computer science. And we have this very esoteric course called formal software development. And this course was completely different from any other courses because there was no programming involved. So it was only blackboard and fun examples. And this intrigued me a lot because it essentially kind of suggested that, okay, unlike other courses where I was supposed to learn a programming language or to develop skills in a particular programming technology, there was this platform or this part of the world in which I could think about programming without talking about actually programming languages. And I thought that was okay. This looks like a clever decision because essentially this will make me flexible for any kind of programming language that will come in the future. So that's kind of the motivation. The other interesting thing about this course is that essentially this was the course that everybody will fail. So essentially the professor, who eventually became my research advisor and so on, essentially he will fail everybody, and then at the end of the course he will say, okay, well, let me just try to adjust the grade so that not everybody will fail.
What a method. Okay. So
there was this part of this esoteric nature of the course. That was also because the lecturer of the course, he is still a very peculiar person who has a great passion for these kind of things. So that got me into the field more or less.
Except for the failing aspect, it sounds ideal. It sounds really good.
Well, it depends because this of course has to do with education, right? So whether you are as a student, you are in a course in order to learn or to discover something else or to simply pass. Or to pass with a huge grade. You see, that's another kind of discussion. But yeah, as a student, of course, you're attracted to these kind of things, or you're interested whether you will have any chance of passing the course.
I see. And so, Davide, what sparked your interest? Why did you go into the field that you're now in?
Yeah, so it's not being a straight journey. I studied philosophy originally, so. And in my philosophy studies, I got exposed to logic, and I grew into it. I also had a very inspiring figure in my studies, Professor Ettore Casari, an Italian logician, actually a student of Giuseppe Peano, so from the Peano arithmetics. So he was a very inspiring figure to me. I followed many courses with him. I also did some research projects with him. So at that point, I really grew interested in logic. And that was also a bit, I've always been fairly good at mathematics, but logic was really the discipline that sort of opened the mathematics world to me. Then from there, I moved to many other pieces of math in my subsequent sort of research. But that's, I think ultimately, to come back to your question, I mean, this is a little bit of the, say, personal parts into it, but obviously there is a fun component. Like, I think I enjoy sort of a bit banging my heads on puzzles and difficult stuff that I perceive as difficult at the beginning. I try to sort of overcome it. I think that's always sort of an internal drive. And what brought me especially to all these collective decision-making problems, where I think something that came out of the combination of this interest for mathematical thinking mixed with my original philosophical interests. So when I studied philosophy, I was also very interested in political philosophy, ethics. So all these sort of big, theories about how a society should be organized, what we want from a good society, from a just society. So I think, my line of research somehow, I think if I have to explain it to me, I think it combines these two passions, and brought me here.
So you started with philosophy, and then how you entered into computer science? You always studied philosophy, and then suddenly you were in AI, having done computer science on the side, or how this mix of maths, AI, computer science, and philosophy happened?
Yeah, I think it happens in a sudden manner, actually, because I was doing my philosophy studies, and for my master thesis, the University of Pisa, where I was studying, they had a sort of exchange agreement with the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And back then, so I was, for my master thesis, I was very interested in studying the logic of norms, so normative reasoning. And there was one group at the University of Utrecht that was sort of world renowned for their work, but they were based at the AI department. So I went for a visit, and they were very, welcoming. I had a great time, and I learned a lot in those few months. And after that, they had a PhD position open that they offered to me, and then from one day to another, I sort of completed philosophy study. And then I ended up working in an AI department, actually. And since then, I remain in the AI community. And I have to say, I was also happy about that, because I could perceive a lot of more dynamism, a lot more sort of drive than I could feel in the philosophy environments where I was operating in before that. So I was happy that I could somehow still maintaining, basically still studying, still doing philosophy, but just by other means in another department. So yeah, it happened somehow very smoothly and suddenly. Yeah.
Did it somehow, because it was in the link to the AI department, feel more relevant to you because you were interested in the societal aspect?
I don't think it was much about relevance. It was more. So I think what pushed me a lot towards logic and sort of more mathematical thinking in my philosophy studies was that I was also a little bit unsatisfied with the lack of rigor and sort of hand-wavy arguments. And I was looking for a way of, tackling problems that you may consider typically philosophical, like stuff, how you reason about norms, what are norms, or what is knowledge, stuff like that. Those are somehow philosophical questions, but I wanted to try to address them in a more disciplined or rigorous
concrete sense.
Yeah, not necessarily concrete
Okay.
in applications, concrete in the sense of being sure of what you write down, and not say like in a looser, just natural language way. So I was really looking for something that I could be sure about. You know, when you prove a theorem, unless you make mistakes in the proof, it is a theorem. And I was trying to approach those type of questions with that type of rigor.
And this could not be done in a natural mathematics, like in a mathematics department, but more so in the AI department?
Oh, well, probably it could have been done at the mathematics department.
Okay.
It's just that it so happened that
I see.
it was completely, it's really chance in the sense, I was a young student, a master student. What did I know? Very little. But there was this group at the University of Utrecht. They were doing something. I read their papers. I was interested, and I could go there. I went. So, but definitely there could have been many other groups, that, and definitely there are many groups definitely in Europe, but also in the US that sort of do philosophy in a mathematical way. So there are many such examples, possibly more at philosophy department and AI department rather than mathematics department. I'm not aware of any mathematics department that would be concerned with, I don't know, questions that are more like in the epistemology, what the philosopher would call epistemology, so theory of knowledge, or theoretical economics, maybe economics department. So.
It's sort of in between. That's also what makes it interesting, of course.
Yeah, I find it quite fascinating that there are some very strong analogies between
Yes.
both your stories, right? You both found your niche into something that is much more abstract / mathematical by studying something in which the language was perhaps either too many languages or too flexible and have too many manners of interpretation, and then found a niche in which you could find an actual precise language that would allow you to make things somehow black and white, rule errors out, or make your theories in. I don't know. I mean, I'm talking about things I don't know. So, making precise sense. What you are saying in the philosophical context. And so I'm curious how far this analogy goes back by thinking also that before you started university, right? What was your aim when you started university, and how did it reflect when you were at university? So did this idea match in expectation when you were at the university, or somehow you found a lot more surprises than what you expected the moment you joined? Jorge, would you like to try?
Well, if I think about the process of me going through university, I can think about, or I can relate to many of our students who actually don't have a very clear idea of what computer science is. And I have to admit, I didn't have a great idea of what computer science is. So I had an affinity for programming and for thinking in terms of computers. So I had a computer at home, which back then was not like the rule like today. My father was himself a programmer in a company, so essentially there was some exposure to that. But when I started, essentially we said, okay, let's give it a try, and then let's see how it goes. And then I was fortunate that I enrolled in a computer science program, actually a computer science engineering program, that had this kind of computer science in the sense of research-oriented kind of courses. Right, because not every single program has that. Sometimes some programs are really into engineering, really into software engineering. Sometimes, like you don't really like, or you are not so much concerned about the research underlying, but actually constructing systems, maintaining systems, and so on. So as I was growing into the program, as I was exposed to things that were more research-oriented, even mathematically oriented, like functional programming, then you start to discover that there is a different perspective to things. Or in a way, a deeper way of looking into things that were very much, let's say, routine or very hands-on oriented, like programming and debugging and these kind of things that are more associated with the software development perspective. So yeah, I have to admit that there was no conscious decision, no grand plan. So essentially, it was just following what was interesting me at that point, and things went out also in a non very linear way. So there's of course an element of luck of getting to know the right people or nice people at the right time, and these in turn influencing other decisions and so on.
And for you, Davide?
Yes, well, I went, in the end, I studied philosophy because I was very interested in sort of philosophical questions. I have to say I was also very lucky to get a scholarship to do that. I think if I didn't have the scholarship, probably I would have gone into something that had a more obvious job perspectives. And in the course of my philosophy studies, of course, I enjoyed them a lot, but I also came to, to develop a little bit of this frustration for the lack of rigor often of what I perceived as a lack of rigor in a lot of philosophy. So, and that triggered me to, through logic and to get into a more mathematical way of thinking about those problems. So in a sense, I got what I expected to a good extent, but also I found something, a whole new universe I was not aware of. Yeah.
So as a student, there's one question that I know most students are eager to hear. Outside your research, what do you like to do in your free time?
Well, I have a family, so I have small children. So essentially, nowadays my free time is about like spending time with them in a way that is also interesting to me. So so I spend time with them, or we spend time with them, and we try to go outside. When I am, let's say, with time of my own, then I watch a lot of football on TV.
Which team are you a fan of?
Well, I follow in general everything. So essentially, when it's like Tuesdays and Wednesday night, and then the Champions League, I just put whatever it's on. But I follow Real Madrid essentially in general. Yeah.
And for you, Davide?
Yeah. So also in my case, it's family. So I have a daughter, and that of course it's a pleasure to spend time with her. And when I have more say me time, then it would be movies. So I like cinema.
What type of movies do you like best?
Really a broad spectrum.
Okay.
So, like I mentioned, 2024, it was a good year because we had, it was 40 years. So there were two old classics that were restored. So Paris, Texas from Wim Wenders, 40 years old. Beautiful movie. But also Pulp Fiction, 30 years.
Yeah.
So, two very different movies, but, I greatly enjoyed both of them. So, on music, I enjoy, there's always music playing back home.
Do you also play music yourself?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in the future.
Who
You
knows?
never know.
Yes, I would love to. Yeah, I would love to. So for me, it's listening mostly. Yes.
And what genres?
Also there, I'm very, I think, eclectic. It can go from Italian pop to, jazz music or classical music. Also hip hop, Dutch hip hop. I enjoy. Yeah, so very varied. Yes.
This reminds me, a few episodes back, I think I asked you, Marcello, do you know what your children think you do for a job?
Oh yes, I did ask them. And Emma just shrugged and went away, so she wouldn't even care answering me. And Jacopo said, yeah, you work in the nice blue building, and there are a lot of people coming by, and you also do like school. So this is what he said. And this is more or less was his description of what I do.
Good.
Oh no, and also, he said, and you like to make multiplications and additions. Which is
great description.
Not really true, but at least he realized that there is something to do with mathematics, I guess. Actually, what does Esther say if they ask her what you do?
Well, actually, back in time, I had to prepare an answer because she was really curious, and I actually take the opportunity to bring her to the office, but not so much anymore. But she likes to do what we do and so on. But the prefabricated answer is I help to make sure that apps work always fine. So when essentially we're having dinner, and then she says, "Okay, what did you do today? How many apps did you fix today?" But she also has this idea of being mathematically oriented. So when I answer, "Look, I had lots of meetings today," and she said, "Okay, well, why don't you do like this? You ask some people to do certain multiplications, and then you ask some other people to do some other multiplications, and that way you divide your effort, and everybody does something nice." So there is also this idea of the software-oriented computing, but also the mathematics of it. Yeah.
Yes.
Nice that she tries to help you out in figuring it out.
Yes. And Teresa, she's a bit too small to realize that what I'm doing.
And Davide?
Well, I will have to carry out this experiment, but I think, I think Aileen, she knows I do stuff with AI and with mathematics.
Does she know what AI is?
Well, to some extent, I have to say. So she follows some nice programs on the Dutch television, for instance, Klokhuis, and they had a very nice 5 episode series on AI, and it was pretty well made, I have to say. So I think she has some idea, and of course, it's something I discuss with her at home over dinner. Yeah, so I think she definitely has a picture, and she definitely also has the realization that it's tightly related with math. And sometimes she has comments about the books that I read, and she looks at that with okay, yeah, that's what Papa, that's what Daddy does. Yes.
I'm curious now to bring it back to the second half of the episode, where we talk a bit about your experience with mathematics and how mathematics entered in your research. Because in different ways I have interacted with your research. Like when I was looking at some of work by Jorge, and I was very surprised that you go hardcore into halting problems, which are very complicated problems in logic, with pretty much hardcore category theory that I really struggle even to figure out, and it's super hard, rigorous stuff. And in the same way, just last week I was meeting with some colleagues in Amsterdam, and in front of the building there was in the same institute a conference in mathematics, optimization or something. I don't remember what the conference was about, but in front of the building, guess who was there? Just Davide there. And so I know that in both of your cases, there is a lot of mathematics involved with your research. And I'm really curious to hear from you, how is it being computer science or AI department, in which at least the outside impression is that you do a lot with real world problem and with hardcore societal relevant issues, but being there doing something that is per se at least very abstract. So do you feel outside the water sometimes people can understand, can relate well with this? I'm just trying to understand it for myself, how is the feeling? Because as a mathematician, very often when I speak to people, even if what they do is not completely abstract, I also have some slightly applied parts, but they are applied in a way that is not real world applications. And so I always get these questions that makes me feel like I don't belong sometimes. So I'm really curious how it is your experience here. I don't know who wants to start.
Shall I go?
Yeah, that's fine.
I have to say, even within, say, AI or the subfield of AI where I'm active in, called multi-agent systems, I think there is a good respect. So there is a lot of, even more than respect, appreciation for theory. I never, say, struggled in that respect within at least the research communities I'm active in. And of course, it remains always possible to somewhat sketch a path of what you're doing towards application. Sometimes it's like direct, and sometimes it's a little bit more indirect and kind of wavy. But it's always there, definitely, because you're operating within the, say, definitely in the AI community. So the link to computational system to software or even robots is always there. But yeah, I never really saw it as an obstacle, the fact that I was doing theory. Perhaps with funding agencies a bit trickier, but I think in the research community it's much, very well appreciated.
Yeah, I will say something similar, although I think that your question has many different layers, interesting ones. So definitely, for instance, in a computer science department, we are the most theoretical group of people, and this sometimes clashes with the external perception, even from people inside the faculty, that, okay, well, you're all doing computer programs, you're all doing applied things, which is a natural, of course, expectation, because people have this idea of computers being everywhere, and indeed they're everywhere, and also the idea that they should be applicable. And computer science has this double, let's say, this double perspective, right? So you have something very applied and even interdisciplinary, but also the fundamental side, and also because computer science was born out from the fundamentals of mathematics, you see. So I think that there is this respect indeed for theory and appreciation to some extent. There is the other dimension which Davide was mentioning, like, which is funding, right? I think that that's sort of a different discussion, because it goes along again some sort of political priorities or how things have evolved. I think that in the Netherlands there is also a huge amount of people that made theory at some point, and they have learned to evolve, and this is great to see. But also this sometimes creates the perception that theory is already done, that we have already done all the things that we needed to do, you see. So, which of course it may apply in certain universities, in certain departments. I think this is quite valid, but in general, so there is the need for theory. And the fact that, there are many things that we still don't understand about software in particular that require thinking, fundamentally rethinking how we do things. So yes, we are the theoretical, let's say, bunch of people. And then there are different perspectives on how this is perceived and how this is appreciated, yes.
And when you work, right, you mentioned that this is rather interdisciplinary in this sense, because there is the side of the application, there is the side of the theory, and there is also the side that some of the people that work on this might be in mathematics department, economics department, or philosophy departments. And I'm curious if, when you work with people in different departments, did you notice differences in the way they work, in the time they take in doing things, in the focus they have toward more or less different applications? How is the experience of working with people that do, say, the type theory, logic, category theory that you do, but outside computer science or outside AI departments?
Yeah, I think there are differences, right? So, and also related to the previous question, right? So, what is theory, what is application? Actually, this may be very different depending on who you ask. Right, so indeed there are people mostly within the mathematic domain who do type theory, logic, who are not really interested, or they are not entirely focused on what is the computational aspect of it, whether, for instance, there will be some programming or technique for reasoning about programs, for instance, based on their theories. They do type theory, they do interesting things. And what we do is apply to them. You see, like, okay, yeah, that's nice, but it's essentially a consequence of things that we don't know. Okay, fine. And then, of course, if you go then to talk to some software companies or to interact in a more applied setting, they will say, well, okay, well, that's too theoretical for us. So it's really on the eye of the beholder, you see. We typically don't, at least in our group, we don't interact much with other disciplines. We do see other disciplines operating, and there are differences, of course, for instance, in the way we, or in the way we publish. Sometimes in computer science, we have this huge role of conferences as peer-reviewed venues, which is different from other disciplines in which journals is the gold standard. You see, we also have journals and we have both, and then sometimes people don't understand the difference. And there are practices of this kind, right? And sometimes also when you do some theory, you would like to convince reviewers or your peers that this has some practical validation, and then you build some software artifact to say, look, this is some guarantee or some evidence that what we're doing is not just theory. Then some practitioner will look at our artifacts and will say, okay, well, of course this will never work in practice. And again, you have these different perspectives, and it's valid, and nobody's fundamentally wrong. It's just like people are on different sides of the corner of the situation, and then they say things differently.
Yeah, but this sounds like a bit of an obstacle in trying to work together. I don't know, this you should tell me, right? From what you say, I think there might be value in working together exactly to figure out what is the trade-offs, right? Where you can push the application and how much you can develop the theory. And so many different ways of working maybe then getting in the way for that. Or maybe it's also language. Like, I don't know, with physics, I noticed that sometimes we say the same words and we talk about completely different things. I don't know if it's the same when you work with or discuss with other people.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it sometimes when you approach some mathematicians and then you talk, oh yes, we do type systems, and then this is kind of an instance of a type theory. Then people say, okay, yeah, I know where you are, where you come from, and there is at least some mutual understanding of, let's say, of a shared vision, right? But I will say that there is another perspective to this, which is what kind of theory do you want to develop, right? So at least from my perspective, I like to think about theory as being guided or being inspired by things that are happening in practice, right? Because of course, this is what brings essentially new insights and what brings essentially to make you realize certain challenges, right? So once again, so the things that we do for programs that are interacting, sending and receiving messages at every second. So this is something that it's challenging, it's relevant, it's societally relevant, and for which there is a fair amount of theory that needs to be developed in order to really and fully understand what's going on, right? Of course, there is perfectly valid ways of doing research in programming languages, formal verification of software and so on, that do not really look into what's going on. And this is a different approach, and it's perfectly valid, and people do great research also without thinking about what is going on nowadays in the programming world. I do think that there should be a good balance in the sense that, of course, you should not be, let's say, just following the trends and say, okay, let's do a theory for X, where X is the current trend. But one should try to be, let's say, play a role of looking into the future and say, okay, well, this is most likely going to happen or going to be a trend, a sustained trend. So let's try to understand what's going on.
I actually find this extremely fascinating, and I also like a lot the fact that you are bringing up that indeed for every problem you have lots of different perspectives, and they all come with their own values and their own reason to be, which is something that I really like, because we always have this idea of every research in its own silos, not very much seen in context of what the other do, and this kind of abstract factions, pure versus applied maths, or pure versus applied whatever, or algebra versus differential geometry, right? Which makes no sense whatsoever. And they are mostly, I think, a perception from the outside. So I think it's very... it goes in the philosophy of the podcast of addressing some of the stereotypes, really bringing this up and showing also that we really appreciate each other's works without having to be like opposing factions. But let me turn on this other side and reflect the original question about the experience of working within so many different fields to Davide.
Yes, so yeah, I do collaborate with researchers, from many disciplines. So, well, I mentioned philosophy, but also economics, also legal researchers, so researchers in law, beside, of course, AI and computer science in many other places of the world. But I have to say, I've always been thrilled and surprised by actually how easy it is to collaborate, even across all these disciplines. And I think the key is mathematics. Is really, I found that as it's really a shared language. So of course there are all these terminological issues around, and you have to smoothen them up. But in the end, I think we understand each other. So I'm really sympathetic with what you're saying, that all these silos are constructions that somehow we grow accustomed to. But I like to think of science as something that really sweeps across all these boundaries that are somehow artificial. So I think in the end, it's really, at least in my experience, mathematics has been a way of collaborating easily with others. And then probably, the differences that maybe are more tangible is like, a paper in economics would look very different from a paper in computer science or AI, or from a paper in philosophy. So there is obviously an internal culture that makes the final product somehow different, but working on the content is really it's been for me always a gratifying experience to see how easily it is actually in the end to work across boundaries. And I'd also like to, because you mentioned this this opposition between applied or pure. I completely agree with you that there's completely somehow we like to think of a sort of spectrum from abstract to concrete or applied. I don't think it's the right way of thinking about research in general, research in mathematics. And I like to tell you this story from the professor I mentioned earlier, Ettore Casari. So he used to say to me, you see, like mathematics is like this Roman god Janus. Janus is this god of change, and it has one head with two faces. One face looks at the past, one face looks at the future. And in his word, he used to tell me, mathematics is like Janus. So there is one face that looks at the real world, and there is one face that looks at, say, the Platonic ideas, but it's one head. So it's something that really combines these two. So I like to think of this opposition with the pure applied to actually let it disappear into this head that looks in two directions.
That's a nice metaphor. And I think this has gone also, like we had a multiple episode with people that do, at least from what you think about extremely abstract math, and then it turns out that they do a lot of algorithms. And people that do very applied maths that instead study extremely abstract problems about functional spaces. So there has always been this limbo, and I think this is one of the point that we have touched a lot, because at least in my experience as a student, there was always this opposition between the groups, which is mostly created by the fact that you create two different programs for applied and theoretical, instead of thinking them as just math, or instead of thinking at the whole as just science or research, right? There is no reason we shouldn't be able to speak to each other, to physicists. But I wanted to get back to one step, because Jorge mentioned some keywords of the type of research he does in the mathematical framework. And I'm curious to the type of mathematics that you do, because I think we discussed a couple of times, and at some point I remember graph theory, and at some point I remember game theory, I think. Am I wrong? Correct?
No, correct. Memory, yes. So, yes, I used a lot of, say, mathematical methods. Yeah, graph theory is one example, as applied to the study of networks, social networks, for instance. Logic, of course, I already mentioned. Game theory and social choice theory, those are, mathematical theories that were born out of mathematicians working in economic theory. They are all related to discrete math, I would say, mostly probability theory. So that's roughly the space, yes.
So going back to the collaborations, if you collaborate with people outside your field, does it then generally take a long time to get to the same point of knowledge? How do you go about introducing everyone to or they need to introduce you, of course. But how long does this take? How do you go about this?
Yes, it depends a lot on the research project. Sometimes you're just on the same page. So when we talk about game theory, so if I collaborate with economists, you know, it's a broad discipline, but it is it doesn't have so many ramifications. So more or less everyone is on the same page. So I can easily collaborate on a game theory project with economists. Similarly for social choice theory. Sometimes there are rather other maybe branches within AI where I'm less familiar to. So, well, Marcello mentioned that was the workshop on, it was a workshop on control theory and reinforcement learning at the CVI in Amsterdam. I grew interested a little bit in reinforcement learning more recently. So in particular, so-called multi-agent reinforcement learning, so where you have this sort of learning by trial and error, essentially. But when you make this learning by trial and error happen across many entities that play a game, an economic game, that it becomes a very interesting problem. I knew very little of reinforcement learning. So for a recent project that actually involved the supervision of a PhD student that graduated 2 weeks ago, I collaborated with reinforcement learning experts. And now, of course, that's an example where we had to somehow grow understanding each other over the even years. But yeah, it's definitely possible, and even more rewarding. You learn a lot in the process. So yeah, getting back to your question, I would say it depends a lot. It depends a lot on the specific research questions you are addressing and the variety of tools that are needed to address them. Yeah.
This is interesting also in the social aspect, because you don't want, in a sense, to lecture your collaborators on something you know more of. So do you just send them a certain set of papers that they should read and then they understand?
No, I think in those contexts, it's an excellent question, because it has to do really with the social, say, dimension of doing science. I think it's very important in those collaborations that everybody feels immediately free to ask questions, no matter how dumb they may like from an expert point of view. So I think it's very important to be able to have that freedom, feel free to ask those questions and get an explanation. Like if I don't know something about reinforcement learning, it's an obvious thing for reinforcement learning researchers, and they explain that to me. And similarly, I can do the same about game theory, say. That's the hallmark of a good collaboration. So
it should be kind of reciprocal.
Ideally, normally it is reciprocal.
Yes.
Yes, but it could also be one way. Like it's also fine. I think in a research, if we're working on a research project, we want to go in the same direction, right? It's a sort of cooperative context, so it's totally fine to not know something and get it explained by a team member. At least that's how I see it, and I think it's very important also that we teach that to our students.
Is this also, do you agree with this, Jorge, in your context?
Yeah, I think of course there are different views on how to do collaborations. I don't collaborate as in very distant areas, but sometimes you do have sufficiently large gaps between perspectives, you see. So I would like to mention this project that will be starting relatively soon, which is about the interplay of logic, what we do in terms of verification, but also proof assistance. And this is a very, on the surface, very strange combination, because you think of something very fundamental, logic or proof theory, then something slightly more applied, which is verification and concurrency, and then you have this very, I think even among mathematicians, very trendy line of work on proof assistance, right? But actually, there is a perfect, let's say, set of values involved in what we would like to do. And indeed, this sometimes involves gaps, right? So like, okay, how do you see these kind of objects? Or are these actually objects that we would like to think as mathematical objects? Are these going to be some more concrete programs? and not only concrete programs, but actual proofs in some very precise sense, in the sense of a proof assistant. So you do have this kind of gaps and this kind of different perspective at looking at something that is essentially the same interesting problem. And you need to be, I think people need to have a humble view on things, right? Like acknowledging, and I think this is not too difficult for many cases, that, you don't know everything. That the same object may be seen and described and perceived in different ways by different people, even working in similar fields. So I think it's, of course, it's a lot about the dimension of how you interact with people. So there is a social aspect of taking a step back, trying to reflect, where is this coming from? Is this actually so incompatible with my view of things? Where can we find a middle ground for developing even a conversation? Sometimes you're just talking about the same thing and you say, okay, well, let me see where you're coming from. So it is definitely a social aspect to it, because usually the gap is less than what you may perceive at the beginning.
I think this is another stereotype, right? That you expect that the experts are there, then they know everything. But the beauty, at least for me, the beauty in the collaboration is exactly that you learn from each other. And in fact, the further away you are, the more time it will take, exactly because you will have to teach each other. And it's a thing that, at least to me, I find it extremely hard to do on my own. Like, I don't have the time to sit with a 400-page books, study it all, start doing the exercises. So if that's the way to learn something, I most likely will not do that. And if instead we have some common interest and we can actually teach each other, then this lowers the barrier a lot, because then now I have my personal expert or experts to whom I can ask everything, and I always hope that it's the same for them, right? That they can just, if they are there, it's also because they are interested in that, and they can ask me anything they want, and we can benefit from each other in this way.
It sounds really like a student's dream to have a sort of personal tutor in an aspect that you really want to know more about. So that sounds very ideal.
But students have, it's just that they don't use it, right? Because between the TA and the lecturer, they in principle could ask as many questions as they want, but very, very rarely they do.
Yes, I guess that depends on the student and also their level of interest. That's true. But they could. But it takes some courage to go to your lecturer. I
think probably between colleagues there is also more of a peer-to-peer relationship than there is between student and...
That's true.
But still, student TAs, probably that's where most interaction happens. Yeah.
And if we can address this, most students are aware of the fact that their professors or TAs are often very busy people. So it might not feel as if there's any room to ask questions. So it's always good to maybe emphasize that they can ask questions, I would say.
But even doing that, I fully agree, by the way. But even doing that, I feel that you still get a small fraction. And I get it. Probably this power relationship makes it harder. But is the similar experience of the TA? We were asking some of students that we had here in the podcast. So did you notice a difference the moment you moved from peer to TA? And they would say yes. So suddenly we started getting less questions. And this is somehow it's really... I think students in principle could do what we do. Like they could discuss and talk to each other and ask each other questions because probably they have different level of understanding. So that maybe it's closer to a collaboration. And then when they don't know as a group, they can ask. And then maybe this levels things up because now it's one that has more power with a group. So it makes you stronger. I don't know. What's your view on this?
Well, I think that that power structures definitely play a role, both in teaching but also in research. So if you go on, if you're a professor and then you say, okay, yeah, I'm an intern or I'm someone visiting, and then this kind of power relation is too explicit or is too prominent in the discussion, it's going to go in a certain way that is different if you, let's say, you have both parties have an open view of things and they just try to collaborate. And for me, the ideal relation in supervision is when you reach a peer-like level, in the sense that at the beginning, for instance, a master's student or even a bachelor student will know very little about what we would like to do. Then I try to provide with the elements for them to increase their knowledge so that we have like an informed conversation. And of course, at the level of master, this goes even further because you can expect a bit more of maturity, and then you would like also to have a more informed view on things about research. And then at the PhD level is really where I would expect to have a peer-like kind of interaction with the expectation that the PhD student will become a more expert than myself in a certain thing, right? So I'm consulting the PhD student about certain things, or actually that I'm just providing high-level orientation about what path to take on a certain problem. So it's definitely power structures are definitely there. We cannot just assume that they are not there. But we should try to do as much as possible just to remove them or to avoid the concrete effects in relationship, either in the lecture, right? So when you're teaching, for instance, when you were describing the situation about not asking questions, I was thinking about my course in my bachelor course in automata theory, which is a course that I really like, and then my question is, how do I promote more questions, right? So of course there are differences on how people perceive lectures, right? So I think in the past there was more the idea, I believe, of I prepare as a student on my own, and then I go to the lecture, and then I confront my knowledge perceived or acquired with respect to what's going to be discussed in the lecture. And then this was probably a better angle for discussions. I think more recently I noticed that people are just, okay, I'm seated here, so what's going to be today? And then, of course, this leaves less time for reflection and less time for inciting questions, right? So, but again, the situation is different for the tutorials of the same course, right? So, and it seems that power structures are there, and it's not so easy just to remove them. And it's interesting and challenging and worthwhile to try to create spaces in which they are not there, so that there is more discussion for those who want to discuss, because that, again, not everybody may be very much interested into a subject so as to start asking around questions.
So what you're describing is that with a certain attitude in a student, there's more room to ask questions for them, to formulate questions, to have reflections. And this is, of course, all from what you expect from a student, right? You expect this from a student?
I don't know. I mean, it really depends, actually, because I have with years I have learned to actually not to try to form a preconcept of students, right? So there are students who are very good and maybe completely silent during lectures, and sometimes they show up at your office with very interesting questions. You see, so I think that education in general should be about like this personal process that people, for instance, ideally, what I tell my students, read the suggested lectures or the suggested material before getting to the lecture, because this will definitely change your perspective on the material. Some students do it, some students don't. This is clear. But there are also many different ways of learning. So you see, for the automata theory course, it's quite interesting, because I feel that, of course, this is very well established subjects, or there are many books, many fantastic books, right? So I'm offering like my perspective on something that is very well established. And I feel that many cases, for many things, my competition is not the books, they are actually YouTube or TikTok, because there are actually many great videos on automata theory, on computability theory, on decidability that are actually much better than what we can do in a lecture in certain ways. So there are also different ways of actually acquiring the information. And it's actually perfectly fine if people don't ask questions, because they will say, okay, well, probably there is this other video, or there is this other material that could complement or could satisfy my curiosity without me having to do this very social act of asking a question during a lecture. You see, so this is also part of the evolving game of education, I will say.
So your point is that it doesn't really matter if you ask questions, as long as you engage in some way with the material and with the topic.
Yes. So of course, being a lecturer, I love to see some engagement, some explicit engagement on questions. It's a way of actually confirming that. You see, I think that anybody who has lectured, they would like to see, okay, are people listening to me? You see, and then questions are the most natural way of getting that confirmation, even if there are difficult questions, or even if there are like dumb questions from some perspective. I think I do really think that there are no dumb questions in lectures, but yeah, there are other ways of actually let's say, confirming that people are engaged in lectures, and this is ultimately what you would like to have.
Is your experience similar? Because when I think of this in mathematics, I can see it very well. Dynamics, I think, are different because we tend to have much smaller classes. At least what I know in computer science. I don't know in AI what kind of size of course and variety of course do you have.
Yeah, the variety is large, so I think that's definitely a variable that matters, right? So I think in a smaller group, so for instance, I teach one first-year class, that's Introduction to Logic, that's a large group. It's asking a question in such a large group could be a barrier, for it may be really down to your personality whether you're up to it or not. So that's an extra factor. I also teach classes at the master level. Those are much smaller, and also those are courses that I teach at the blackboard or whiteboard. And in those contexts, it's much easier, I think, to instill the attitude to ask questions, because also the lecture maybe progresses at a more maybe and as a sort of, when you write at the blackboard, there is another pace in the lecture. Probably it stimulates, it's easier to get into process your thoughts, maybe ask questions, and definitely if you're in a smaller group, the personality, what could be a personality barrier to ask a question in a group, maybe just smaller. So I see more questions coming in those contexts, rather than a big class. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly, I do think of times as a student that the lecturer would be very, very fast, often using slides, and then suddenly ask, "Are there any questions?" No? Okay, and then turn around again, and then I didn't have any time to anticipate that they would ask a question. So yes, writing on the blackboard or whiteboard certainly helps, I can confirm. And taking your time if you ask for questions to see if there are any questions.
Very important, I agree, yes.
Do you have more suggestion from the point of view of the students on what, at least from your perspective, what has helped with your engagement in the courses you had? Right, you have done a bachelor and master, so you have quite a number of courses now that you can build your experience upon.
Well, I'm of the personality type that I do ask a lot of questions, which makes me ideal probably for this podcast. But yes, and it's maybe a bit based on some negative experience as well. That if you invite people to ask questions, even though you might think, okay, that's a quite not dumb, but trivial question to ask. I just explained this. Why do they ask this question? Don't punish them for this question. It does still happen. I'm not sure why this is, but always stay respectful towards this person who is very vulnerable in that moment of asking this question.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that's very important, and that's I try to make that very explicit to students, even from first lecture. There are no stupid questions, and if a question involves the repetition of something I just said, I will repeat it. I commit to that explicitly. So I think I agree, it's very important. If somebody asks a question, they put themselves in a vulnerable position towards the rest of the class and towards the lecturer. So yeah, you have to be aware of that. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, and in some sense it might be common sense for most people, but it still happens. I've still seen it a lot, so that's why I'm repeating it now. Yeah.
Important.
Yeah, I fully agree. I really like what I've learned from Tamás, that he also makes a fuss of his own mistakes. Like, if he makes some mistakes on the board, he doesn't wipe it. Now he put a big rest cross, make sure that everybody see that he made a mistake, and then they correct it together. So you show somehow making yourself also vulnerable. You hope that this is leveling up a bit this barrier. But I agree, that's a really important point, right? It's what Jorge was saying. I don't believe there are dumb questions. I mean, if you have a question, it's something I might have not explained in the right way, or I can try to explain differently. What's the problem?
No, and the other point is that actually, for me, questions are actually a great resource because they are usually the symptom or of the indicator, something that possibly could go deeper. And actually, this says, okay, well, probably then you repeat what I have just said using different words or trying to come up with a different example. Because usually, if there is someone asking a question, there is quite a likely possibility that that many other people will have, or several other people will have something similar, right?
Indeed.
And it's great, right? And the moment you start encouraging these questions and try to see it as opportunities to revisit or to recast what you have just said, then actually this is quite valuable, actually.
Yeah. And also, when the answer of the student go in a very wrong direction, that's the opportunity to actually together see why it's wrong and how we can recover or reason to make it right? So it's a massive help also for you to drive the intuition of the student from an angle that you would have not thought yourself. So I think there is a lot of value there. I fully agree with all of you, in fact. Circling a bit, since the time is moving fast, I still have one question I would like to ask you. So we have addressed a lot of stereotypes in this podcast so far, but mostly about mathematics and mathematicians. And so I'm curious about what are the common stereotypes that you have around your field or what you do that you think it would be worth addressing in a few minutes.
Well, I think Jorge already touched a little bit upon, for instance, the perceived importance, of course, of, say, computer when we talk about computer science or AI. So the fact that, well, if you work at an AI department or a computer science department, then, well, obviously you must be building software or robots and not do something else. But I always like in that context to remind people of a quote by Edgar Dijkstra. He said, computer science is no more about computer than astronomy is about telescopes. And I like that, and I think that also it's in the end it's about if we talk about computer science, AI, it's a lot about algorithmic thinking, and algorithmic thinking is deeply embedded in math. So that's how I always try to dispel this, or at least smoothen up a little bit this picture of the computer scientist as somebody that builds programs or robots.
Are the stereotypes from the people in the maths department the same as those from society? Do they overlap?
Well, when I talk with my colleagues in maths, I would not think of them as having this image of computer science and AI at all. But it's more like a bit of a cliche, societal cliche, if you wish. So no, definitely my colleagues in maths know better. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's interesting to talk about stereotypes because, of course, there is one point about your colleagues, and then you say, well, at least your colleagues sort of understand to some level what you're doing, right? But in general, I think that there is this, as following what Davide was saying, there is a huge societal stereotype indeed now with AI, and now people talk about the algorithm. You say the algorithm decide this for me, and then which in many cases, I mean, if you're using some app or whatever, so there is some algorithm deciding things for you, right? And the actual sense and deep meaning about what an algorithm is, that it's something that is meant to be done by a computer ideally and so on. So this is completely overlooked, right? And this is what I find, on the other hand, very fascinating about computer science, right? So, and also applies to AI. So these are technologies, and they proceed independently from research at a huge pace, right? So everything is changing fast. You have these new devices, you have these new apps, you have these new technologies. And yet, in parallel, there is the research on computer science, research in logic that enable these kind of things. And then people may say, okay, why do we need all this research if we have all these apps, right? And I think this is the biggest stereotype nowadays, that people tend to take for granted that things are going fine, and then no more research is needed, because essentially things are great, and then we have self-driving cars, and then we have recommender systems, of course, which are great, and then essentially everything has been done. But this, of course, this is not quite the situation, right? So, and sometimes some of these stereotypes, you see them not necessarily inside your department or your neighboring department. Sometimes people from other departments inside your same faculty say, oh yeah, but so you're computer science, so you must be busy with AI these days. And then, of course, it's an external perception from society that sometimes goes back, so spills down to university. So, but at the same time, it's also an opportunity to say, okay, well, actually, there is some work to do. There is some interesting challenges ahead. And there is some work to do also at the level of how you teach these things. I think that that teaching also plays a very important role in actually you positioning yourself with respect to the professionals of the future, right? So in my courses, I don't know how successfully, but I try to set out also to say, look, I'm a researcher. So the things I'm teaching you right now is essentially something that I already know, because essentially this helps me in my everyday work. If anything, just to write down things precisely, or to have a way of communicating with my colleagues. So I think that it's also the level of particularly in computer science professionals, they need to be aware about the fact that there is research. That research is needed, and is going to most likely will be needed in the short term and the medium term in the future, in order to provide answers to the challenges that we know and the challenges that we still don't know, and to bring down these stereotypes to just that, and not at the professional level.
Well, that's wonderful note to actually conclude the episode, in my opinion. But I want to ask you another question. So, sorry for the bummer, we won't conclude all these beautiful notes. But in this direction, I think you also made some nice videos, right? You have developed some videos to explain your research, the use of your research, and why it can be relevant. Also to, I don't know, what was the target? Maybe kids population, what was it?
That's a great question, because it was a very, so these are videos. I think we developed 2 or 3 videos, or 2 actually, at the end were finally produced, about essentially what logic and computation are, right? So I have to admit that at the beginning I had in mind like the broad audience, but in the process of producing the videos, then we realized that we had to be a bit more careful. So there were different purposes behind this video. So one is essentially to highlight our research, so that, for instance, if the rector of the university would like to know what I'm doing, then essentially this will be able to provide some indication. But also, if my parents would like to see what I'm doing, then also they will be able to follow, and so on, right? And it was also a purpose of a group binding activity, in the sense that the videos were produced in a moment in which new staff members came to our group, and then it will be nice just to have this nice group project in which we are all represented. And it also goes back to the point of how you actually are represented in a research group, and how actually your research is visible. So it also served a bit of role in that respect. And the videos were produced with a professional designer, and the process of actually going through the task of designing and producing a video was extremely rewarding. And it was not easy in the sense that we had to really think carefully what we're addressing, how we're explaining things. The first, let's say, audience in that process is the designer, because of course she had to actually to come up with a script, and she had actually just to plan some sequences. And sometimes we have to say, look, we are oversimplifying here. And sometimes there is this tension in which you have to say, oh yes, of course I'm oversimplifying, but if I give the full details, then of course nobody will understand things. So this is very interesting. It takes some time, more time than actually I had anticipated myself. The first video was actually supported by the Young Academy Groningen, so that was more or less how we started looking into this. And it's a great experience. I would like to have actually more availability to do more videos, but and I have had also great reactions actually. So that's also nice to see.
Can you send me the link? I'll put them in the episode notes.
Of course, I will do that. And it's great food for you to think, okay, where are you really placing, right? So of course, research-wise, we all have our plans, but also in terms of visibility, in terms of how people perceive your area. Now that indeed, as we were discussing before, so there is this idea of AI eating up the world. And essentially people say, okay, why do we need software if we have AI? And then you say, well, actually, software is the key enabling element of AI. So there is also this element of how things are positioned and the value of fundamental research and the position of fundamental research for being an enabler for a better society ultimately.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so we were talking about public engagement, and I'm I also think it's really important for research nowadays to do that. I've also have many rewarding experiences with that, and I enjoy doing that. Last year, for instance, I was advising the city of Assen. They were doing participatory budgeting. So we're coming back to that topic, participatory budgeting for their youth in the city. So the city had roughly 100,000 euros that they wanted to invest in projects for the youth, and the youth had to come up with those projects, and they were put some to vote through an app developed for that purpose. And they somehow got in touch with me because they sort of realized that it was not easy to come up with a good voting method for that problem. And in fact, there has been, in my circles, in this computational social choice community in the recent years, there have been a lot of work on trying to understand how to do that fairly. So I was very happy to advise them, and in that context, it was great because I was invited to talk to the youth of Assen and present the voting method I was proposing, and that was a great session because there were a lot of questions and a lot of really interesting insights, also from a research point of view. So, and after that, after I explained the method to the youth or the representatives of the youth of the city, then I was told that the youth went to the city council and explained the method. They did it to the city council, and that's great, right? So if we manage to get science sort of infiltrate our society in that way, I think it can only bear good things. And so I really think that doing outreach, being out there, also with an open mind, it's something that can really contribute something from our point of view as scientists.
Thank you so much. And with these other positive notes, now it's really time to end the episode. Thank you both very, very much for being here and talking with us. And thanks, Anna. And thank you all for listening. And if you like this episode, don't forget to share it with your friends and on your social network. And see you next month.